We're going to be looking at everybody's favorite memory verse here today, John 11, verse 35, and why it is that Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus. Uh, this is not everybody's favorite memory verse, I don't think, because of the content. I don't want to give myself more credit than that. It was my favorite as a child because it was easiest to memorize. It's just two words long, of course. But the content is absolutely there, and it's motivated more preachers than just one to spend half an hour or so talking about what caused Jesus to weep on this particular occasion. And I'm going to offer you several possibilities. I think I can defend one pretty definitively. I think that there's one cause for Jesus weeping that we can pretty close to prove from the text. I feel very confident with that. There are several others that may be true, and that certainly, whether they're true or not to the actual context, are going to reflect accurately on the story of Jesus and his character and his interactions with the people of the day and his interactions with us as well. So I don't feel uncomfortable speculating a little bit as long as we stay rooted to the text and make sure that we're speaking as the Bible speaks in a general sort of sense. I do want to start with the one argument that I can make with pretty much 100% confidence. Why would it be that Jesus would weep? In the first place, it's because Jesus cared. And in the particular context here, he cared about Mary and Martha. Not Lazarus so much, although obviously he cared for Lazarus. That's the understanding of the people at that time. They see how he cared for him. I think that's the one thing that we can be relatively confident Jesus is not weeping over. He's not weeping over Lazarus because he knows that he's about to bring him back from the dead. And Lazarus is fine where he is. This is not a sorrow for his departed friend because his friend's coming back. It's different with Mary and Martha, though. He is sitting there with Mary and Martha, and they are in pain. And I don't think it would be fair to say they blame Jesus for this, but they certainly see Jesus at the center of all of this. Both of them say, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. That may or may not be true. Jesus passed on opportunities to heal people at various times. One would think he would have healed Lazarus if he had been there, but the text is really pretty clear that he deliberately avoided being there. It would seem because he was going to do this, because he was going to raise him from the dead instead. That doesn't minimize in the slightest the emotional pain of the moment. Not just Mary and Martha's pain, but Jesus' pain. And I think that says something very profound and very important to us with regard to the character of Jesus. Lots of times I think that we are in a real haste to get Jesus to the cross so he can die for our sins so that we can be forgiven and we can have hope of heaven, which is all perfectly adequate. I don't apologize for any of that. But I do think that perhaps we bypass some of the consideration of the way Jesus lived his life while here on earth, if for no other reason than to serve as an example for us so that we could walk in his steps. But I think it's very helpful, to me at least, maybe it'll be helpful to you today, to look at the emotional side of Jesus, the human side, if you will, and see that as, to a certain degree, a model for our own behavior, of course, but also, really more importantly, a reflection on the kind of Savior that we are serving. Jesus is the one who cares about people who mean nothing to him, who are indifferent, who are irrelevant in the big picture, you might say, or at least we might think of people that way. That's the way we do think of people. Jesus did not. Jesus didn't see any irrelevant people. He saw some bruised reeds. He saw some dimly burning wicks, but, and insert your own intelligence joke there, I suppose. But he did not dismiss people because of their circumstances. You may not spend a whole lot of time around reeds and wicks, picking out good ones and bad ones or whatever. But in a Bible setting, if you were going to pick a reed for some kind of task, you pick it because it's firm, because it's rigid, because it's relatively hard on the surface at least. You go down to the river, you pick yourself a good one. If you find one that's been stepped on, find one that's been bent in some fashion, well, you just bypass that one. That one does not suit my purposes. I'm moving on. And you don't think about it, nor should you think about it. But the next time you're at the river and you see a reed that has been bent, think about your Lord, because he, given the language of Isaiah chapter 42 verse 3, would get down into the river and bind up this reed. This reed is not healthy. It's been damaged. I don't know exactly how effective it would be to put a splint on a broken reed, as it were, and nurse it back to health. The main point that Isaiah is making, the main point that I'm making, is that we would never think to do that. It would be pointless for us to do something like that. It's just a reed, after all. Jesus doesn't look at humans that way. A wick in an oil lamp that is seemingly done for, as it were. How difficult is it to replace a wick? It's a piece of string, a piece of cloth. What's the big deal? Just get another one. Well, maybe there's some life in this one yet. Maybe we can trim it and prepare it and in some way deal with this wick where it might continue to burn. It might continue to serve a function for the owner of the lamp. We might not think of doing that. We might just move on. This is something that has no value to us, or very, very little value. Well, you have value to Jesus. Mary and Martha had value on that particular day, and all of us have value to him in one fashion or another. There's a great statement there in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 16 and 17, and he refers to Isaiah chapter 53 and the story there about how he has borne our infirmities and carried our sorrows, etc. And we are used to applying that, as Peter does in 1 Peter chapter 2, to spiritual things, to spiritual maladies, that he heals us of our sin sickness. And I don't doubt that that's the main point. But it's worth noting here that Matthew, by inspiration, refers to that same passage and applies it to physical things. That he healed people in a physical way because he cared. Because it moved him. He himself took our weaknesses and carried our diseases. This is what Jesus does, because Jesus genuinely cares about people. And think about that the next time you're feeling sorry for yourself, or you're not thinking that anybody's paying attention to you, or having a little pity party or whatever. That doesn't work with regard to Jesus. You can't do that. At least not accurately, as we sing sometimes in our assemblies. Oh, yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. It absolutely is. And if it's true for Mary and Martha in that day, it's true for you and me today. And that should make a difference, knowing that we have a Savior who not only rules, but also cares and ministers to us, especially when we're the most in need. I think that explanation stands on its own, and I think that if someone were to suggest that's the only point that we're to derive from John chapter 11, verse 35, I would not necessarily have an issue with that. That very well may be true. There are some other points that may be involved in this, and that certainly reflect on the character of Jesus, the behavior of Jesus, our relationship with Jesus accurately. And I'll give these things to you, and you can take them for whatever they might be worth. It is suggested by some, and I think there's some credit to this, that part of the reason Jesus is weeping at this moment is not because he misses Lazarus, but rather because he has an idea, maybe a very specific idea, of what's going to happen when Lazarus comes back from the dead. Now, I don't want to get into God's head very much here. I don't know what it was like for Jesus to live as deity in human flesh, what exactly that means. Does he know absolutely everything that would happen to absolutely every human being in every absolute moment of their life for all of it? I don't know. I literally don't know. It could be. It certainly could be. And if that's the case, then he knows he's setting Lazarus up for a lot of trouble by bringing him back from the dead. Not to mention the fact that he's bringing him back from the dead in the first place, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But the idea of introducing Lazarus into the world that is waiting for Lazarus when he comes back is a daunting thing. Let's just put it that way. I'm quite sure that Jesus thought Lazarus was up for it. I don't think that he is endangering Lazarus' soul by introducing him to this horrible set of circumstances. But it's without question, assuming that Jesus knew what was going to happen, and I think that we can reasonably assume that he did. There are people who are going to try to send Lazarus back where he came from, essentially. That's told to us in John chapter 12, verses 9 through 11, that some people respond to this miracle by trying to kill Lazarus, at least planning to kill Lazarus. How successful they were, we have no way of knowing. It's been suggested, and I will throw this out here for you. We're speculating here a little bit. I'll speculate a little more. And I wish I knew who I could credit for this idea, but because this really struck home with me. Very few of my good ideas are original. I'm sure I picked this up from somebody. But it has been suggested that the reason Lazarus is not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and why he plays such a prominent role in his raising from the dead, plays such a prominent role in the book of John, is because of this persecution. I'll explain what I mean by that. Very shortly, reasonably shortly, within a matter of days or weeks, people are plotting Lazarus' demise. He is a blight on the status quo. He is a problem to be dealt with. And one of the theories, at least, one of the ideas about how to deal with this problem is just kill him. It could very well be that when Matthew, Mark, and Luke are writing their gospel accounts, Lazarus is still alive. And because of that, every bit of publicity Lazarus gets brings him that much closer to trouble that might be waiting for him around the bend. And it may be out of respect to Lazarus. Mary and Martha are mentioned, by the way. Lazarus is not. It may be out of respect to Lazarus that they avoid not just telling this particular story, but even mentioning Lazarus' name. An act like this is going to spread like wildfire one way or the other. There's no point in fanning the flames, as it were. Not that dying in the cause of Jesus would be the worst case scenario, as it were, but we don't want to create problems. We don't create pain for people that we care about, people that we respect. It very well may be that that's what Matthew, Mark, and Luke by inspiration are doing, or not doing, if you prefer. By the time John writes his gospel account, many say several decades later, it could very well be that Lazarus is already dead at this point, and telling the story is not going to cause any harm to Lazarus or anybody else. I cannot defend that. I cannot prove that point, but you can take it for whatever it might be worth. I think it's worth at least suggesting, though, that Jesus is aware that this is not simply a matter of giving relief to friends of his who are in pain. This is going to cause pain, and Jesus is aware of that, or at least I believe he was aware of that. Another speculative point that I'd like to throw out at you, and this might have to do with the appearance of a man named Lazarus in a completely other context, in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, and you know the text that I'm talking about there. And this is another bit of speculation here that I'll throw out at you, since I'm feeling my oats, I guess, or whatever. There is a story given to us in this text about a man named Lazarus and some rich man that goes unnamed. And these two men in the story that Jesus tells, they both die. And Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man goes to torment. And I don't want to get into a big discussion about specific details of what happens when you die, or where you go, or is there a waiting room, and what's it like, and what's the color of the wallpaper. I don't want to get into that. But I will suggest this, that the whole point of Jesus' story that he tells there is that this rich man had plenty of opportunities to live his life in a godly, a responsible, a kind-hearted way, and he chose not to do that. And I don't doubt that that is true in a broader sense. I think that this man this is not an actual story Jesus is telling. It's a parable like all the rest of them. But if he were a real person, this would not be the only example of his indifference, of his callousness, his lack of love. But his treatment of Lazarus is a good example. There they are, just on opposite sides of the chasm. And Lazarus is being comforted, although he suffered a great deal in this life, which, by the way, speaks to the idea that this is not the Lazarus that we know from the book of John. This is a different character named Lazarus. And the rich man wants Lazarus to go back and speak to his brothers, because surely anything I could do to take care of people who I love, and keep them from coming to this place where I am, I would be willing to do that. And Abraham says, well, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And the rich man doesn't seem to think that's going to work, because obviously they have the scriptures. He says, no, if someone came back from the dead, they would listen. And Abraham says, if they will not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not listen even though someone were to come back from the dead. I think that's exactly why this character in this story gets a name, and why that name happens to be Lazarus. I don't think that is a coincidence in the slightest. I said before that Luke doesn't tell the story of the raising of Lazarus. It very well may be, I believe anyway, that he is alluding to it here, that there is going to be somebody who spoiler alert, is going to be named Lazarus. In the next few months, he is in fact going to die, and he is in fact going to come back from the dead and tell his story. And it's not going to have the impact that you think it's going to have. Are some people going to be astonished? Are some people going to be moved? Are some people going to be moved to confess faith? Sure, I'm sure that they were. But the only actual reaction, other than shock and awe in the moment, that we see is the opposite of that reaction. We see what we see in the story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 16 about the rich man and Lazarus. We see people dismissing this, finding excuses to dismiss this. And this is a discussion that we have a lot in all kinds of different contexts. There are people who would have us believe that all it would take is if the preacher man were to go down to the hospital and start walking the aisles and healing people left and right, then people would be drawn to this, and they would be excited about this, and they would take notice of this preacher and the message he was preaching. And certainly if he went to the graveyard and started raising people from the dead, well, that would be proof that just could not be ignored. And surely many, many souls would be brought to Jesus by actions like that. There is simply no biblical foundation for believing that. None at all. It makes perfect sense to me. I'm sure it makes perfect sense to you. That doesn't mean it's true. There are a lot of things that I think make a lot of sense, which clearly are not true. And such is the case with this. We have Abraham's word on it, and essentially Jesus' word on it, that miracles are not the creators of faith. That's not the way that it worked. In fact, that's not really the story that we read, Old or New Testament alike. We don't see people who rejected God, and then these miracles were done, and all of a sudden they became believers in God and completely committed themselves to lifelong service. There were times when people got turned around, at least in the short term, no question about that. But as far as people who have determined in their heart to reject Jesus, miracles aren't going to change that. And that also is a source of sorrow for Jesus. How could it possibly be, knowing what I'm going to do, knowing the kind of non-impact, at least non-impact for good, that we're going to see as a result of this? It's just astonishing. I don't think that Lazarus was raised from the dead for the sake of the people in the day. I think there were two reasons why Lazarus was raised from the dead. One, to comfort Mary and Martha. I think that's a point that is worth making. Mostly he made it for us, as we read separate from that. This is the ultimate testimony that Jesus is in fact the Son of God, that he is in fact the Savior, other than the resurrection itself, of course. We can read these things, as John goes on to write in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. We can read these things and see this character of Jesus. We don't have to be there firsthand. We don't have, in fact, being there firsthand probably wouldn't help. You're either going to be someone who is open to faith or someone who is not open to faith. And I hope and pray that you are open to faith and you're not one of these doubters that would just try to commit murder as some kind of opportunity to say no to Jesus. There's one other point that I want to mention before we close, and this may be the most relevant point for you and me, the most emotional point perhaps, and that simply is this, that Jesus is, after a fashion at least, taking Lazarus from a better place and taking him to a worse place. I want to not overmake this point. I want to emphasize here, at least in passing, the breadth of my lack of understanding with regard to what happens after we die. The Bible just does not address this very directly, very specifically. We mentioned the rich man and Lazarus. You might try to derive a lesson from that. There's some pretty amazing images in the book of Revelation. You might try to derive some messages from that. Jesus talks about a house that he's building for us. He's going to receive us to him in John chapter 14. You might derive some lessons from that. By and large, what we are told is you die, and then the faithful are welcomed into the to the heavenly realms, the blessings that God has waiting for his people. How exactly that works out, what kind of timetable there is there a literal judgment day? Is there a literal waiting line where the sheep and the goats are lined up side by side? I don't know. I don't think that's the main point of Matthew 25 or any of these other passages that give us visuals to go along with the story of eternal accountability. I am personally very strongly persuaded that any kind of rationalization about the afterlife that involves time is missing the point. God dwells separate from time, and when we pass from this life, we pass from time also. Uh, Time does not transpire, at least it doesn't seem to me it does, after this life is over. Practically speaking, I don't know what that means. That's why I stay out of the weeds with this. What some have suggested is that Lazarus is where the other Lazarus is. Essentially, he's in a place of comfort, whether you call it the Abraham's bosom or call it heaven or the Hadean realm, whatever you want to call it, that he's in a place of comfort, and he is yanked out of that place of comfort and placed into this world of woe. If that's what actually happened, I am not going to split a church over something like that. That does not seem to be reasonable on multiple levels. What we are deriving out of this, the one main message that we do want to take from this, regardless of what you think happens to souls after the body dies, we are not at home here in the flesh. This is not where we belong. We are citizens of heaven, the text says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20. That is where we belong. And however you want to look at timetables, or if you want to look at timetables at all, it's unquestionably true, assuming that Lazarus is one of the faithful, and we can safely assume that he is, that this is a step backward for him. Coming back to this world to live some more time on earth, which apparently he did, that is not something that is in Lazarus's best interest, not in the obvious sense, at least. And I don't want to get into a big, long discussion about foreordination and free will and all that kind of thing. I'm not a Calvinist. I don't believe that Lazarus loses his free will. Well, he was in heaven. I guess we can't send him to hell now because, Jesus cheated him out of heaven. That's not the way this works. I'm confident of that. I will say this at least, that we as the people of God can find our contentment in this life or in the next life, either one. And we can find a way to be happy and joyful in this life, even if we are prepared to go to the next life and for whatever reason it's not working out that way. Paul makes that point in Philippians chapter 1 and starting verse number 21. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, if I live on in the flesh, this means fruitful work for me, which obviously is a good thing. And I don't know which one I should choose. I'm torn between the two, for I long to depart and be with Christ, for it is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. I don't think we're supposed to derive from this text that Paul actually has a literal choice to make with regard to this. I don't think that's the point. But if you were to choose, either one would be a good thing. That you could stay here and do God's work, which presumably Lazarus is going to do, or you could depart and be with the Lord. Whatever comfort we may get from extended life, whatever comfort we may get from a loved one, for instance, coming back from death's door, whatever we take away from that, let's not lose sight of the main issue. That is that we are not primarily trying to extend our stay here in this pain-filled, sorrow-filled, ugly world. We are going to heaven. And I'm not suggesting that we ought to hasten the trip, that we ought to, I won't finish that sentence. I'm not suggesting that faster is better just because it's faster. Nor was it that way for Lazarus. But we should spend quality time thinking about where we really want to spend our time, where we really want, and if time is even an appropriate word to use there, where we really want to be, what our actual home is supposed to be. I hope that we can be the kind of souls that Jesus genuinely reaches out to and welcomes into his arms and lifts up and carries to heavenly realms, whether it's in the short term or the long term. But in any case, not be the ones who cause him over sorrow, that cause him pain and suffering any more than we absolutely have to. All of us, of course, are going to sin and fall short of the glory of God, and that itself is painful. But let's spend our time here on earth focusing on spiritual realities, drawing closer to Jesus, knowing fully well how much he cares about us, caring us enough about us to go to the cross in the first place. That ought to be proof enough right there, let alone what we read here in John 11:35. But in any case, realizing how much the Lord loves us, how much he cares about us, that he cries tears over us in a very real sense, and once upon a time did so in a physical sense. And let's take that visual, take that image, take this one particular tiny verse and use it to motivate us to love the Lord more, to serve the Lord more, and to long for heaven more. That's what he wants for us. That's what we ought to want for ourselves. That's what I want for you. So I hope and pray that this is a blessing to you and that it draws you closer to God and closer to heaven. Continue to study, continue to look on heaven and heavenly things, and draw closer to the image of Jesus. God bless.